Hey everyone, this time we looked at three versions of The Punisher, the arcade game and Sega Genesis game, and also the NES version. Sega Genesis and arcade games are both beat 'em ups, and those are really more of the games that I personally enjoy. The NES version was pretty fun, and I really wasn't expecting what I got from LJN because the game's pretty well made and it's above average, I think. It's a rail shooter, which could have been better done with a light gun, but it wasn't. You just kind of move the cursor around the screen with the D-pad. So regardless of what version it is, your ultimate goal is to beat the Kingpin. There's some weird stuff going on with with the arcade version and the Sega Genesis version, and that's that you can play as Nick Fury. I thought this was a little bit weird at first, but it did actually make some sense. But first, let's get to the NES version. I was having some problems with it, so this is going to be kind of quick, but it is still a pretty good game. So the NES version is actually pretty good. I'm not too sure what the developers did for this and why it didn't translate to some of the other games LJN did, but it's a pretty fun game. You're basically moving Frank Castle left and right, and you're shooting just about anything that, you can see on the screen. The entire environment is pretty destructible, and there are a lot of power-ups to find. I was having a few problems with my controller, but for the most part I could get through it. I think if I swapped out and tried a third one, everything would have been fine. While the NES version was pretty fun, I would have preferred if it was a light gun game. That type of a rail shooter where you just move the cursor around, it's not the way that I think it should have been done. It would have been a lot cooler if it was a light gun game. Now let's get into the two beat 'em ups with the arcade version and the Sega Genesis version. These are the two that I really liked, but that's because I like beat 'em up games a lot. So which of these two is actually the better game? As you can see, they essentially play the same. They are going to follow the same, basic storyline. This really is essentially two versions of the exact same beat 'em up. Now, when I was really comparing these, I unfortunately couldn't get like a really clear picture of the arcade version just because of the way I had to try to videotape it. So the Genesis version is gonna look a little bit better as far as, some of the colors being washed out or something along those lines. So, while the Genesis version might not be, as graphically sound as the arcade version, it was still based on arcade hardware, just on the System 16, so it's not going to be as polished as the arcades. That being said, they're both really good, and the Genesis version is a competent version of the game. So I'm playing the arcade version on my Arcade 1-Up cabinet, and it's really good. It's a nice, smooth version of the game. And it also kind of has that 1-up on being, having free play mode for me. So I didn't have to really worry about the continues or anything like that. And I could just, go to town and use my supers as much as I wanted and kind of abuse the system. Now both games have like the same, basic weapons and everything like that, which again, they're pretty much the same. The arcade version has a lot more blood in it, just because they could get away with that, in the arcade version as opposed to on the home console. Even though Genesis does let them get away with quite a bit. The arcade version does have more, detailed sprites and everything along those lines, but that's because it's on more sophisticated hardware. The controls on the arcade version are really good, and I found it was a little bit easier to pull off special moves, especially when you try to use your grenades. I'm not exactly sure why that was. I think it just had to do with, the arcade being a little bit of a better port to play, and, the fact that I was trying to use a Genesis controller as well, so it might have been a little bit different. One thing I really love for both games is that the entire environment is destructible. It's just a lot of fun to go around and break things and wonder why the hell you found, like a sword or a hammer inside of something. Or if you find a grenade inside of a random picture, or something crazy along those lines. So the Genesis version is still a very faithful port of the arcade version. You can do an awful lot in the Genesis version, especially when it comes to, going into different modes of the game, and also, it seemed like it was pretty easy to, recover life and everything like that. There are only a few instances in the Genesis version where I felt like they were kind of shortening the game up a little bit. It wasn't like super noticeable, but just every once in a while I would kind of wonder why I got through something as quick as I did on the Genesis port. It did feel a little sluggish moving castle around the screen on the Genesis port. I don't really know if that was, operator error or the way the actual game is played. It could have been either one, to be perfectly honest. I tend to blame myself for stuff like that, but it was sort of noticeable and I just wanted to point it out. As I mentioned with the arcade port, this one had, a little bit of a harder time, actually doing all the special moves. It wasn't too bad, I could still do them, but I just found it was a little bit easier with the arcade port. Maybe it was because Genesis, sometimes does this where they try to justify having a third button on the controller by making it do something. Whereas the arcade, you just really use two buttons, and then to pull off a special move, you just pressed both. Now that being said, all of the weapons that were in the arcade port are here in the Genesis port. It's just really fun, picking up what's supposed to be a fire extinguisher and it turns out to be a flamethrower, or grabbing a hammer or a samurai sword, or just the random guys that run around with axes for some strange reason. There's also a lance in the game too, which I don't really understand why that weapon is there, but I mean, it's a welcome addition. It's kind of fun to, run around with that. So if you can't get a hold of like the arcade port for whatever reason, the Sega Genesis version is a very, very faithful port to the arcades. It's really, really great, and I do highly recommend it. Really worth it. So there's one interesting thing with both the arcade and the Sega Genesis version, and that's the gun modes in the game. Now let's talk a little bit more about that. So the gun mode in the game is pretty cool. It adds sort of that hint of realism, so it doesn't make it feel like you're trying to beat some dude up with a pistol while you only have just your fists. When you do run into those enemies, Frank just whips out his 9mm, which I'm assuming is what gun he uses, and just starts taking shots at the enemies. You do get to pick up a machine gun at this point, which I believe is an M16, but I'm not totally sure, so it just kind of evens the odds. So all three of these turned out to be good games. While I do like the arcade and the Sega Genesis version, and honestly I prefer the arcade to the Sega Genesis, the NES one was really able to kind of stand out, especially on the NES library, and it also made up for a few of the other comic book titles that we got on the NES that weren't quite as good, like Superman or the X-Men game or even Wolverine. So anyway guys, that's going to wrap it all up. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a great day.